this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can set up some basic parameter validation rules for your API. So what kind of situation calls for this? Well, if you remember our post user API call, which creates users, it doesn't really enforce which parameters are required, whether they have to be numeric, whether a valid email has to be passed in, etc. Right now, it'll pretty much accept anything. So let me show you how you can go ahead and set up some basic validation rules. And the way I'm going to go about this is there is a plugin called Restify Validator. I've searched for a few. This one seems fairly simple and intuitive to use. So to install it, it's just npm install Restify Validator. So we can head to the command line, stop our server, and type npm install Restify Validator. And I'm going to save it as a dependency so that it gets saved in my package.json file. So I'm going to go ahead and execute that, which shouldn't take very long. There it goes. And if I now go to my code, I'll see that in my node modules directory, the Restify Validator is there and available to use. And in my package.json file, it's indicated that Restify Validator is a dependency for my particular project. So everything looks good so far. The very first thing that I have to do is create another variable which we can call Restify Validator. And here we are just going to require the module, similar to how we do for requiring Restify. And then what we're going to do now that we've separated all of the code out in a more modular kind of way is pass the Restify Validator variable to our setup controller. And if you recall, our setup controller has the server.use statements. So what I can do here is simply add another line that says server.use Restify Validator. And Restify Validator has to be passed in, which we just did in our app.js. We passed it in here, and in our setup controller, we are receiving it in here. Make sure to close that brace. Okay, and believe it or not, that will be enough to get us up and running. So the first call that we may want to validate is the getUser API call. So the way we can use this particular plugin is we can say rec.assert and then the name of the parameter that we're validating, ID, which is coming in from the URL. And this is the message if things don't go well. I can say ID is required and must be numeric. And the way that I actually enforce that is I can call these functions not empty and isInt. So assert that this particular request variable ID is both not empty and is an integer. Now I can say var errors is equal to rec.validation errors. This is going to check if there actually were any errors. And then I can say if there were errors, what we are going to do is call helpers.failure. This is the function that sends our API response. Pass it our response object, pass it the next object. We're going to pass, in case there were multiple errors, I'll pass the very first error that was encountered, which will be stored in errors 0. And the standard HTTP response code for when fields are not passed in correctly is 400. So if there are errors, I'm going to short circuit this function and get out by outputting the errors. and the rest of the function is exactly the same. So what happens if I start up nodemon app.js? Looks like nothing crashed. And then if I create a bunch of users the exact same way that I did before, we haven't modified that call yet. And I'm going to try to get user number 3 instead of the number 3. It says failure, param ID, ID is required and must be numeric. And it even shows the caller of the API what the value that was passed in was. So if I were to pass in nothing, again, same message, ID is required and must be numeric. So we can see that everything appears to be working, and if I pass in a valid number, then we can see that it actually returns a successful API response. Okay, in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to round off the validation of the post, delete, and put API calls, and I'll see you in the next lesson.